At first glance, it looks almost too simple. A collection of brick boxes, the bearing structure completely evident, but behind this apparent simplicity lies one of the most influential architectural offices working in Spain today. And this is, of course, Harquitectes. Their work is redefining what it means to build sustainably, not through flashy technologies or excessively complicated strategies which are only greenwashing, but through material honesty and climatic logic. This house, the house in Sant Cugat del Vallès, is but a wonderful example which shows their philosophy. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So who is Harquitectes? Let's start from the beginning. As they were finishing their studies at the ETSA in Catalonia, Roger Tudor and Josep Ricard get together to do their final projects and some student competitions. Soon after, they were joined by Xavier Los Majo, and then David Lorente Ibáñez completes the team. As he already had a few commissions, but he wasn't too comfortable doing them on his own. I'm gonna stop here a minute. I'm gonna say this is a very smart strategy. I mean, if you're a young student and you have commissions, it's good to put your ego aside and understand that maybe this is too much for you to do on your own. And this actually plays into the philosophy of Harquitectes, who remain humble to this day in spite of the wonderful work they're doing. So going back to the story, they graduated in the year 2000, and that very same year, Harquitectes set up in Sabadell, just outside Barcelona. Immediately they already had some success, but I think that the tipping point was actually in 2009. It is here that they win more important competitions. First, it's a student housing for their former university, followed by the Cristalleries Planell, which we're going to go in further detail later in this video, and the ICTA ICP Research Center. These projects put them with their philosophy right on the spot. Now, what is their philosophy and ethos? In their own words, they embrace complexity, but not complication. This is what I believe leads them to restrict to a maximum their material palette. So they come back to the use of brick, amongst other things, because, as they explain, it's a material that local contractors feel comfortable with. And again, this is very important. They keep in mind the traditions and push them forward. This is why, I believe, Jesus Vasallo, when writing an essay about them, refers to their architecture as a modern vernacular, because it's an architecture embedded in and of its place. So again, they go back to the use of brick and they leave it unrendered because they like the story it tells. It tells the story of the construction. But they go beyond that of limiting the material palettes, because they also limit, in a way, the elements. So they're trying to have as few elements do as many things as possible, assigning multiple roles to the different elements that constitute the building. And for this, I have some brilliant examples given by the architects themselves from their own essay, which I highly recommend, which is called The Nature of Buildings. So they say a bearing structure can also play a role in the climate control system. And this is seen in the ICTA ICP research building. A roof can make a building watertight, protected from the elements, and it can also stimulate the natural ventilation, as we can see in the Cristalleries Planell. And a circulation space can stand in for thermal insulation, as we can see in the Lleialtat Santsenca. Sorry, my Catalan is not that good. Again, these are all examples given by the architects themselves. I'm not going to take any credit for finding these, but I think they illustrate the philosophy brilliantly. Similar to Lacaton and Basal, who by their own admission influenced them enormously, they think of a space and they conceive it from the inside out. So again, the humility Xavi showed when he joined them by accepting that these commissions could be too much for a young architect is again shown by this approach where they are facing design challenges from inside rather than saying, here I am and this is my architecture. And this attitude of remaining humble is something that is taking them really, really far. It has also helped them, as different authors say, navigate the crisis of 2008. They did that by, as I said, remaining humble, and also by using noble materials the local contractors knew how to use. That resulted in more efficient architecture, which was desperately needed and outplayed the Starchitect model that was being predominant until the late 2000s. Another phrase that I read in the different essays I read as I was doing research for this video really stuck with me because I can really relate to it. And they say that their idea of sustainability is directly linked to the behavior, not to the building. I would complete this phrase by saying it is indirectly related to the building. So the building plays a huge role. I'm not gonna say it's not, but the role the building plays is, as they say, is in encouraging people to behave in a sustainable manner. Basically, what they're saying is that a well-designed building will result in less energy consumption because the user of such building will be encouraged to inhabit it in a certain way which is sustainable. And I might add that the user will feel that much better in that kind of a building. So finally, they close with this phrase, and I quote, "It's the use, not the object, that can be sustainable." And I simply couldn't agree more. Now, before delving into the Cristalleries Planell, which is the project I chose to showcase more their work, I'd like to take a moment and analyze the climate they are working in, because as I'm saying, it plays a huge role in the design behind the architecture. I extracted data for the climate for Sabadell, which is where Harquitectes are based. Here I'm showing you the dry bulb air temperature. These are mean hourly values, so you have 24 values for each month, which are averaged. With this, I'm gonna group the months in cool, warm and mild periods. You can see that you still have temperatures in the cool period that reach or are above 15 degrees Celsius. This is quite significant. Look at my weather here in Brussels. It's quite different. And I'm showing you this as a comparison because then the architectural strategies are going to be different, even if our approach could be similar, because I tend to agree with what I just said about Harquitectes' philosophy. Nevertheless, if I apply it in my climate, it should look different, and that is the basis of sustainable design. Now look at the solar radiation. When looking at the solar radiation, you can see two curves for each month. Again, these are average hourly values, so they peak during midday, as you would expect. The inside curve, that one refers to the diffuse component, so the radiation that is coming from the sky dome itself, not the solar disk. So this is radiation that is just bouncing around. It's very hard to block from this sort of radiation. But the component of the diffused over the global is quite low. Again, look at my case. In my case, the direct component is quite low, and the overall global I get, I wouldn't say it's insignificant compared to theirs, but so what does it all mean? It means that in Sabadell, you always need to design with solar protection in mind. The sun is strong throughout the year. In summer, you block it. In winter, you modulate it to still capture useful heat. And given that you have such a high daily amplitude, the use of thermal mass is something that will benefit the building that you're making, because it will flatten out the diurnal temperature peaks. That again is quite different to the strategies I have to implement, where I need my insulation to trap my heat and stop it from going out. So for that, I need to rely more on resistive insulation. The building, Cristalleries Planell, was originally built in 1913 and it was the most important glass factory in Barcelona. However, it became abandoned for quite some time before the municipality launched a competition which Harquitectes has won in 2010. The architects preserved the facade. Probably they had to because it was a listed facade. But they gave it a new life with this glass material to the top. This makes a reference to the history of the building itself, while also providing much needed daylight inside the building. Although the entirety of the plot is built, it has a certain setback with a double facade, creating patios to the north and to the south. These patios help it regulate the heat and the noise coming from the street. Basically, they work like buffer zones. There's a lot of very interesting qualities to this building, but there are a few lessons which I think are crucial, and I can think of two particular ones. The first one is that the architects themselves disclose how challenging it was to reach their goals, because the environmental strategies they wanted to apply, so in this case cross ventilation, was at odds with the program. They couldn't link the patios and have cross ventilation in the classrooms because this would have created too much noise and would have gotten in the way of the program itself that they were building. Now, any other architect would probably just walk away and think, okay, natural ventilation is off the table then, because we cannot couple this with privacy. And this is the interesting part, and this is what sets them apart. Because we all have good intentions, but when it becomes hard, we have to be more creative rather than dismiss the whole point altogether. And the solution they came up with was brilliant. So they stacked the classes one on top of the other, and then on top of each unit they had this massive crystal chimney which would just suck out the air. So fresh air would come in from the lower levels and would rise, and because of the temperature difference it would accelerate. Of course, they're not new at this kind of solution. I mean, this is an age-old strategy, but they are quite bold in applying it. And here I come to the second lesson we can draw from this building. And that is that when they were confronted with the size of the chimneys, I can only imagine how shocked they were. But again, instead of saying that's just too big, it's not going to be aesthetic or whatever, again they doubled down and said, okay, let's use this as part of the design strategy. Let's give this building a personality with these chimneys. And that they did. So that is where the brilliance of Harquitectes comes into play. Not because they built a nice building with thermal mass, which they did, but also because they stuck with the environmental solutions they wanted to bring to the table, and they carried through these ideas in spite of the challenges becoming increasingly harder. Now, it's also interesting to compare this project with the ICTA ITC or ICT, because the ICTA has a more active approach. And by that, I mean that it had active controls where one facade could open and close depending on the conditions outside and depending on the people as well. But then they realized that this is not the way they wanted to go. Now, don't get me wrong, the ICTA is a beautiful building as well, and it's a reference on its own as well. I like it as well. But this one is meant to work more passively. It means that these are passive strategies that require less energy and less moving parts. And that again is all that more interesting, because moving parts in buildings are, for one, normally expensive, and two, they require high maintenance, so again, expensive, and they usually break down. Nevertheless, of course, they did require the use of energy in the Cristalleries Planell, but they relied more on geothermal. In this bioclimatic section, Harquitectes take different ranges of temperatures in the different spaces. And here you can see how the buffer spaces usually have a wider range than the proper spaces themselves. This is normal. These buffer spaces are not conditioned normally, but they are protected spaces, so they are going to reduce the loads for the conditioned spaces themselves. Finally, let's talk about daylight. By setting an internal facade away from the listed facade and creating that patio, light is bouncing around the two facades and is better distributed, so there's less harsher patches of light. This is also complemented by the fact that you have the zenithal light coming from the top, obviously, hitting the other part of the classroom. So daylight levels are not contrasted too much. So then our eyes can adapt to the darker areas and perfectly see in the bright areas as well. What I mean to say is that the daylight in this building must also be working brilliantly. And that's another energy saving strategy they have. Now, to offset the roughly 30 kilowatt hours they consume of energy, which is a third of that a comparable building, according to them, they make use of geothermal. So what do you think of this building, or Harquitectes in general? Do you agree with me that they could be the ones leading the way forward? Now, if you want to learn more about daylight and daylight design in buildings, click on the video appearing on your screen now. See you in the next one.